Japanese prison of war. Women couldn't stop whispering. Those black American soldiers looked like movie stars. Through the acrid smoke of battle, Emiko Takahashi pressed herself against the crumbling concrete wall, her white nurse's uniform stained with dirt and blood. The thunderous explosions of American artillery had become a constant companion over the past several hours, each blast sending tremors through the ground beneath her feet. Her hands shook as she tightened a bandage around a wounded soldier's arm. The young man barely winced. They had all grown numb to pain in these endless hours of combat. Around her, the makeshift medical station was overflowing with the injured and dying. The metallic scent of blood mixed with gun prison of warder made her stomach turn. "Takahashi-san," one of the other nurses called out urgently. "We're running low on supplies." Emiko wiped sweat from her brow with her sleeve, leaving a streak of grime across her forehead. She had lost count of how many wounded she had treated since the Americans began their assault on Saipan. The 43rd Division was falling apart around them, their defenses crumbling under the relentless bombardment. Another explosion rocked the building, closer this time. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling. Through the window, Emiko could see American tanks advancing through the streets, their heavy treads crushing everything in their path. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she realized they were being surrounded. "We must prepare to move the wounded," she ordered, her voice steady despite her fear. But even as she spoke, she knew it was too late. The first American soldiers burst through the door, their rifles raised. "Hands up! Hands up!" they shouted in English. Emiko understood enough to comply, raising her trembling hands above her head. Around her, the other nurses and mobile patients did the same. The next hours passed in a blur of confusion and terror. The Americans herded them together, separating the men from the women. Emiko watched helplessly as her male patients were led away. She and the other women were gathered in a courtyard, their medical supplies confiscated. They spent 3 days in temporary holding cells, cramped together with little food or water. The women whispered among themselves, sharing stories they had heard about American brutality toward prisoners. Emiko tried to maintain her composure, to be strong for the younger nurses who looked to her for guidance. But inside, she was terrified. Finally, they were marched to the coast and loaded onto a transport ship. The vessel was large but sparse, with metal benches bolted to the floor in the hold where they were kept. The air was thick and stale, and the constant rolling of the waves made many of the women seasick. Days blurred together as they crossed the vast Pacific. Emiko lost track of time, marking the passage of days only by the meager meals they were given. The women huddled together for warmth at night, whispering prayers and trying to comfort one another. "They say we're being taken to America," one woman murmured during their evening meal of rice and fish. "To a place called Angel Island." Emiko stared down at her bowl, remembering all she had been taught about Americans, their savagery, their hatred for the Japanese people. What horrors awaited them on this Angel Island? The name seemed a cruel joke. Through the small porthole in their holding area, she could sometimes glimpse the endless expanse of ocean. She thought of her family in Kyoto, who would never know what had become of her. Had she survived the battle only to face something worse? The uncertainty gnawed at her more than the hunger or the discomfort of their cramped quarters. As the ship plowed through the waves, carrying them closer to enemy shores, Emiko clung to her training and dignity. Whatever awaited them, she would face it with the honor expected of a soldier of the Emperor. But in the darkness of night, when the others were sleeping, she allowed herself to weep silently for all they had lost. "Before you continue listening, please let me know where in the world are you watching from today." Now back to the story. The metal gates of Angel Island's prison of war camp groaned open, and Emiko Takahashi's heart hammered against her ribs. Her legs felt weak after the long sea journey, and the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on her face. She shuffled forward with the other women, their feet dragging in the dust. Then she saw them, black soldiers. Her breath caught in her throat. The propaganda posters flashed through her mind, the ones that had shown black American soldiers as monsters, barely human. She'd been taught they were the most savage, the most cruel. Several of the women around her stiffened, and she heard a few sharp intakes of breath. But the black soldier nearest to them smiled warmly. "Welcome to Angel Island, ladies," he said in clear, gentle English. "I'm Corporal, Washington. We'll get you settled in right away." Emiko blinked rapidly, her mind struggling to reconcile what she'd been taught with what she was seeing. The black soldiers moved with casual grace, their uniforms crisp and professional. They spoke softly to each other and to the white soldiers, who treated them as equals. "This way, please," another black soldier said, gesturing toward a long building. We've prepared fresh water and food for you all. The women followed, still tense but increasingly puzzled. Inside, tables had been set with basic but clean plates and cups. The smell of hot food made Emiko's stomach growl. Real food, not the meager rations they'd had on the ship. Please, sit wherever you'd like, Corporal Washington said. We have rice, vegetables, and fish today. If anyone has dietary restrictions, let us know. Emiko translated for the women who didn't speak English, her voice shaking slightly. This couldn't be right. Where were the harsh commands? The rough handling? The cruel treatment they'd been warned about? A young black soldier brought them each a cup of water, careful not to make sudden movements that might frighten them. Drink slowly, he advised kindly. You've had a long journey. As they ate, another soldier explained the camp rules. Simple, reasonable things about mealtimes, cleaning duties, and restricted areas. No one shouted. No one threatened. When one woman accidentally dropped her cup, a soldier simply brought her another with a reassuring smile. Emiko watched it all with growing bewilderment. These men moved with a quiet dignity she hadn't expected. Their dark skin gleamed in the light streaming through the windows, and their white teeth flashed when they smiled. Some of them were quite handsome, she realized with a start, like the movie stars in the American films she'd seen before the war. Later, as they were shown to their barracks, clean, with real beds and blankets, Emiko caught the eye of Yuki, her friend, from the medical corps. Yuki's expression mirrored her own confusion. I don't understand, Yuki whispered in Japanese. They're treating us like people. Emiko nodded slowly, watching as Corporal Washington demonstrated how to operate the heating stove. His hands were strong but gentle as he explained the safety features. Nothing about him matched the monsters from the propaganda posters. Get some rest, he told them as he finished his explanation. Tomorrow we'll show you around the camp properly. If you need anything during the night, there's always someone on duty. As he left, Emiko sank onto her assigned bed, her mind whirling. Everything she'd been taught about these men seemed wrong. The respect in their eyes, the careful way they treated the women, it was all so different from what she'd expected. She looked at Yuki again, seeing her own uncertainty reflected back at her. Neither of them spoke, but they didn't need to. The question hung in the air between them. How? Could everything they'd believed about these soldiers have been so wrong? The morning sun cast long shadows across Angel Island as Emiko and her fellow prisoners stood in neat rows before their barracks. Their muscles ached from the long journey, and uncertainty hung heavy in the air. A tall American officer approached, his posture rigid and commanding. I am Captain Stevens, commander of this facility, he announced, his voice carrying across the yard. A Japanese-American interpreter translated his words. You are now prisoners of war, under the protection of the Geneva Convention. Emiko's eyebrows furrowed at the unfamiliar term. She glanced at the other women, noting their similar expressions of confusion. This means, Stevens continued, pacing slowly before them, that you will be treated with dignity and respect. You will receive adequate food, medical care, and shelter. No one will harm you here. The women exchanged skeptical looks. Emiko's training had prepared her for torture, for cruelty, not this strange promise of kindness. She studied the captain's face for signs of deception, but found only stern professionalism. You will be expected to follow camp rules, Stevens explained as the interpreter kept pace. Daily roll calls, scheduled meals, designated work duties. Cooperation will make your time here easier for everyone. The morning passed in a blur of instructions and procedures. When lunchtime arrived, the women were led to a large mess hall. The scent of cooked food made Emiko's empty stomach clench. She hadn't eaten properly in days. As they lined up with their metal trays, Emiko noticed the serving station was staffed entirely by black soldiers. Her grip tightened on her tray, remembering the propaganda warnings about these men being especially savage. But as she approached, a young black soldier, Ifases, his name tag read, Washington, gave her a gentle smile. Ma'am, he said softly, ladling a generous portion of stew into her tray. Would you like some extra bread? Emiko stared at him, struck by the unexpected kindness in his voice. His eyes held none of the hatred she'd been told to expect. When she didn't respond, he simply placed 2 rolls on her tray instead of 1. Behind her, she heard similar exchanges. Another black soldier was explaining the different foods to a confused prisoner, his patience evident in his careful gestures and slow speech. Yet another noticed an elderly prisoner struggling with her tray and immediately stepped around the counter to assist her. The food itself was another surprise. The stew was hot and filling, the bread fresh. As Emiko sat with her fellow prisoners, she could hear their whispered conversations. "They're feeding us better than our own army did," one woman murmured in Japanese. "Did you see how that tall one helped Tanaka-san with her tray?" Another whispered, "I thought they would treat us like animals." Emiko watched Corporal Washington as he continued serving. His movements were efficient but gentle, his manner respectful. When a young prisoner spilled some water, he quickly cleaned it up, assuring her it was no trouble. The contrast between what she'd been taught and what she was witnessing made her head spin. "Would anyone like seconds?" Washington called out, his words translated by the interpreter. "There's plenty more." Several women looked up in surprise, but none moved. Washington began making his way around the tables, offering more bread and stew to anyone whose tray was empty. When he reached Emiko, their eyes met briefly. There was something in his gaze, not pity, but understanding, that made her throat tight with emotion. "Thank you," she managed in careful English, the words feeling foreign on her tongue. His smile widened slightly. "You're welcome, ma'am. Just let us know if you need anything else." As he moved on, Emiko stared down at her tray, her mind churning. Everything she thought she knew about these men, about this enemy, was being challenged. The food in front of her, the kindness surrounding her, none of it aligned with what she'd been prepared for. It was unsettling, this realization that perhaps not everything she'd been taught was true. The mess hall buzzed with hushed conversations in Japanese, like a nest of disturbed bees. Emiko watched her fellow prisoners huddle together during breakfast, their eyes darting toward the Black American soldiers who served them their morning portions. She noticed Yumi, one of the younger nurses, actually smile when receiving her bowl of rice. "Did you see how gentle he was?" Yumi whispered to Emiko in Japanese, sliding onto the bench beside her. "The tall one with the kind eyes. He made sure my portion was extra full." Emiko stirred her own rice, remembering the propaganda posters that had depicted Americans, especially Black Americans, as monsters. Yet here they were, serving food with careful movements and patient smiles. It didn't make sense. "I heard Nurse Sato say they remind her of those American movie stars," another woman chimed in from across the table. "The ones we used to see in films before the war. So handsome and dignified." "Quiet," Emiko warned, though her own gaze drifted to where Corporal Washington stood. He carried himself with an elegance that seemed at odds with what she'd been taught about Americans. His uniform was always crisp, his manner professional but warm. Throughout the morning, Emiko couldn't help noticing more signs of the soldiers' unexpected behavior. When elderly Mrs. Tanaka stumbled on her way to the latrines, 2 black soldiers rushed to help her up, their touch careful and respectful. They even waited to make sure she made it safely to her destination. Later that afternoon, Emiko sat in the camp's medical station, trying to hide her nervousness as Corporal Washington examined her hand. She'd cut it while helping clean the barracks, a small injury, but one that needed attention to prevent infection. "This might sting a little," he warned, his voice soft as he cleaned the wound. His hands were steady, gentle, nothing like the brutal grip she'd been taught to expect from enemy soldiers. Emiko flinched slightly at the antiseptic, and Washington paused, giving her time to adjust. "You're doing fine," he assured her, his words carrying an unexpected warmth. As he wrapped the bandage around her palm, Emiko found herself studying his face. His features were strong but kind, his movements precise and careful. She thought of the whispers she'd heard in the barracks about how these soldiers carried themselves like the glamorous actors in pre-war American films. "How does that feel?" Washington asked, securing the bandage. "Not too tight?" "No," Emiko responded, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "Thank you." Their eyes met briefly, and Emiko felt something shift inside her, a crack in the foundation of everything she'd been taught to believe. This man, this enemy soldier, had treated her wound with more gentleness than some of her own superiors had ever shown. Back in the barracks that evening, the whispers continued. "Did you see how Corporal Washington handled old Mrs. Tanaka's cough?" one woman murmured. "Such patience, such care. And have you noticed how they never shout at us?" another added. "Even when some of us break the rules?" Emiko sat on her bunk, looking down at her bandaged hand. The women's voices swirled around her, full of wonder and confusion. They spoke of the soldiers' dignified bearing, their movie star good looks, their unexpected kindness. Each observation was like another small crack in the wall of hatred they'd been taught to maintain. "It's like they're not even our enemies," Yumi whispered from the next bunk. "How can they be so kind when we're supposed to be their prisoners?" Emiko didn't answer. She was too busy trying to reconcile the gentle touch of Corporal Washington's hands with everything she'd been taught about American barbarity. The disconnect left her feeling unsteady, as if the ground beneath her feet had suddenly shifted. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as Emiko swept the entrance to the women's barracks. Her movements were automatic, practiced from weeks of the same routine. The wooden handle of the broom felt smooth against her calloused palms, a familiar comfort in this strange place. She heard footsteps approaching and tensed, her grip tightening on the broom. It was Private Harris, one of the younger black soldiers who often patrolled this section. His uniform was crisp, and his boots were polished to a shine that caught the early light. "Good morning, Miss Takahashi," he said, his voice carrying the soft drawl she'd come to recognize in some of the American soldiers. In his hand, he held something small and purple, a wildflower he must have picked from near the fence line. Emiko's hands froze on the broom handle. She stared at the flower, then at Private Harris's friendly smile, her mind struggling to reconcile this gentle gesture with everything she'd been taught about American soldiers, especially Black American soldiers. "For you," he said, extending the flower. "Saw it growing by the fence. Reminded me of the ones my mama used to grow back home." Emiko's throat tightened. She looked around, uncertain. Taking gifts from the enemy felt wrong, like a betrayal of everything she believed in. But refusing might be seen as disrespectful, and she'd learned that maintaining peace was crucial to survival. With trembling fingers, she accepted the flower. "Thank you," she managed in careful English. Private Harris smiled wider, nodded, and continued his patrol, leaving Emiko standing there with the small purple bloom in her hand. Inside the barracks, the other women gathered around her, their voices low and urgent. Nurse Yamamoto, who had served with Emiko in the same medical unit, touched the delicate petals with wonder. "Why would he give you this?" she whispered in Japanese. "What do they want from us?" Emiko shook her head, still staring at the flower. "I don't know. They keep being kind." "It must be a trick," Sergeant Tanaka insisted from her bunk. The older woman's face was lined with suspicion. "They want us to lower our guard. Remember our training. The Americans are savage beasts. They're just trying to confuse us." But Yuki, one of the younger nurses, leaned closer to examine the flower. "My brother worked with Americans before the war," she said softly. "He said they weren't all bad. Maybe." She trailed off, looking nervous about voicing such thoughts. Emiko sat on her bunk, turning the flower in her fingers. The gesture reminded her of home, of the small garden her mother had tended. How could someone they were taught to hate show such thoughtfulness? The Americans in their propaganda films had been portrayed as monsters, especially the black soldiers. Yet here they were, offering extra food portions, speaking gently, and now this, a simple flower given with no apparent ulterior motive. "I don't understand," she admitted to the group of women who had gathered around her bunk. "Everything we were told. It doesn't match what we're seeing here. The food they give us is good," another woman added hesitantly. "And when Corporal Washington helped me yesterday when I dropped my tray, he was so polite." The women fell into an uneasy silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The flower sat in Emiko's lap, its purple petals bright against the dull khaki of her uniform. Everything they'd been taught about the enemy was being challenged by these small acts of kindness, these moments of humanity that shouldn't exist according to their training. "Perhaps," Emiko said finally, her voice barely above a whisper, "perhaps what we were taught wasn't entirely true." The words felt dangerous, almost treasonous, but they hung in the air like a truth that couldn't be unspoken. The other women shifted uncomfortably, but no one contradicted her. Instead, they stared at the small purple flower, this tiny symbol that had thrown their entire worldview into question. The morning sun filtered through the windows of the camp's medical facility as Emiko folded clean bandages, her fingers trembling slightly. She'd been assigned to assist Corporal Washington, and the thought made her stomach twist with uncertainty. The propaganda images from her training flashed through her mind, cruel faces, barbaric actions, yet none of those matched the gentle demeanor of the man who now entered the room. "Good morning, Miss Takahashi," Corporal Washington said, his voice warm and steady. He carried a box of medical supplies, setting them down carefully on a nearby shelf. "I hope you're feeling well today?" Emiko nodded stiffly, her eyes fixed on the bandages. "Yes, thank you," she managed in careful English. "There's no need to be nervous," he said, noticing her rigid posture. "We're just organizing supplies today. Nothing too challenging." He smiled, and something in his expression reminded her of her father's kindness. As they worked side by side, Washington maintained a respectful distance, explaining where different items belonged. He showed her how to properly store the penicillin vials and demonstrated the American method of rolling bandages, different from what she'd learned in Japan. "You have experience with this," he observed as she efficiently sorted through medical instruments. "Were you a nurse back home?" "Yes," she replied, surprised by his interest. "In Kyoto Hospital." "That's a beautiful city, I've heard," he said, continuing to work. "Though I've never been there myself." Hours passed, and Emiko found herself gradually relaxing. Washington's movements were deliberate and careful, his manner professional but kind. When she dropped a bottle of iodine, she tensed, expecting anger. Instead, he quickly helped her clean it up, assuring her that accidents happen. During their lunch break, they sat in comfortable silence until Washington offered her half of his chocolate bar, a rare treat in the camp. The simple gesture broke something inside her. "Why are you kind to us?" she asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. We were told Americans would be monsters, especially." She trailed off, ashamed. Washington didn't flinch. Instead, he set down his half of the chocolate and looked at her thoughtfully. "Especially black soldiers?" He finished quietly. Emiko nodded, her cheeks burning with shame. "Let me tell you something about being a black man in America," he began, his voice steady but tinged with sadness. "Back home, I can't eat in certain restaurants, can't drink from certain water fountains. Some folks look at me like I'm less than human." He paused, adjusting his medic's armband. "But I still volunteered to serve my country because I believe in what America could be, not what it is, right now." Emiko listened, transfixed, as Washington shared stories about growing up in Georgia, about the segregated military units, about fighting 2 wars, one against foreign enemies and another against prejudice at home. "So you see," he continued, "I understand what it's like to be judged before someone knows you, to have people look at you and see only what they've been told to see." His eyes met hers with quiet dignity. "That's why I choose to be kind, because I know what it feels like when people aren't." Emiko felt tears welling in her eyes. She thought about all the hatred she'd been taught, all the fear she'd carried. Here was a man who had every reason to be bitter, to treat his prisoners with contempt. Instead, he showed compassion. "I was wrong," she whispered, the words feeling both terrible and freeing. "Everything they told us, it was wrong." Washington simply nodded, understanding in his eyes. They sat together in the afternoon light, the distance between enemy and captor slowly dissolving into something more human. The setting sun cast long shadows across the camp as Emiko sat on her bunk, her fingers absently tracing the edges of the bandage Corporal Washington had applied earlier. The careful, gentle way he had wrapped her hand kept replaying in her mind. His touch had been professional yet caring, nothing like the brutal handling she'd been warned to expect from American soldiers. Her fellow prisoners moved around the barracks, preparing for evening roll call, but Emiko remained lost in thought. She remembered the propaganda posters that had decorated the walls of her training facility in Japan, grotesque caricatures of Americans, especially the black soldiers, portrayed as monsters waiting to torture and kill Japanese prisoners. Yet here was Washington, with his warm smile and soft-spoken manner, completely shattering those carefully constructed fears. "You should change that bandage soon," he had said earlier that day, his voice carrying genuine concern. "Keep it clean and dry." Such simple words, but they kept echoing in her mind, along with the way his dark eyes had held such kindness when he looked at her. Emiko's hand moved to her chest, where an uncomfortable tightness had formed. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. She had been prepared for cruelty, steeled herself for torture and humiliation. But kindness? That was more devastating to her certainties than any physical hardship could have been. "Takahashi-san," one of her bunkmates called softly in Japanese, "it's time for roll call." Rising from her bunk, Emiko joined the line of women filing out of the barracks. The evening air was cool against her skin, carrying the salt tang of the bay. As they assembled in their usual formation, she noticed Washington standing with the other guards, his posture straight but relaxed. When his gaze briefly met hers, she quickly looked away, her chest tightening further. The whispers started near the back of the formation. At first, Emiko tried to ignore them, but fragments of Japanese reached her ears. "They're playing with us," one woman muttered, "making us lower our guard. Did you see how Thompson smiled at Yoshida today?" Another added, "These black ones especially, they want us to trust them. Then they'll show their true nature." "It's all an act," a third voice agreed. "Remember what we were told about them?" Emiko's stomach churned. The voices of her fellow prisoners echoed the doubts that had been gnawing at her own mind. What if this was all elaborate deception? What if Washington's gentleness was just a mask, concealing something darker? She thought of how he had shared stories of his own struggles, of facing discrimination in his own country. The raw honesty in his voice when he spoke of wanting to prove himself worthy of his uniform, despite how others treated him. Could anyone fake such vulnerability? But the whispers continued, insistent and poisonous. "They're not like us. They can't be trusted. Remember your training." Emiko's fingers found the bandage again, touching it like a talisman. The evening roll call proceeded as usual, with the American soldiers efficiently counting and recording their numbers. She watched Washington's movements as he performed his duties, searching for any sign of deception or hidden malice in his bearing. The kind face she had begun to trust now seemed mysterious and unreadable in the gathering dusk. Was she a fool for letting her guard down? For allowing herself to see humanity in these men who were supposed to be her enemies? The certainty she had felt earlier in the medical facility began to crack and splinter, leaving her adrift between two opposing truths: the enemy she had been trained to hate, and the man who had shown her nothing but compassion. As the roll call ended and the prisoners began their return to the barracks, Emiko lingered for a moment, caught between wanting to believe in Washington's kindness and fearing she was being naive. The whispers of her fellow prisoners followed her like shadows, seeding doubt in the fragile new understanding she had begun to build. The morning sun filtered through the medical tent's canvas, casting long shadows across the supplies as Emiko organized bandages into neat stacks. The familiar scent of antiseptic filled the air, mingling with the warmth of the California summer. Corporal Washington worked nearby, his movements precise as he inventoried medicine bottles. The quiet rhythm of their work had become almost comforting to Emiko over the past few weeks. She glanced at Washington's hands, strong but gentle as they handled delicate glass vials. Those same hands had treated countless wounds with care, regardless of whether they belonged to American or Japanese soldiers. "Corporal Washington," Emiko began, her voice soft but clear. She had been practicing this question in her mind all morning. "May I ask you something personal?" He looked up, his expression open. "Of course. The other women and I, we notice how differently you treat us compared to what we expected." Emiko's fingers fidgeted with a roll of gauze. "But I also notice how some of the white soldiers treat you. It's not right." Washington's hands stilled on the medicine bottles. He took a deep breath, and for a moment, Emiko worried she had overstepped. But when he spoke, his voice carried no anger, only a weighted wisdom. "Back home in Georgia, I couldn't even drink from the same water fountain as white folks," he said. "Couldn't go to their schools, their restaurants, their neighborhoods. Had to step off the sidewalk when they passed by." Emiko's eyes widened. The injustice of it struck her deeply. "But you still fight for America?" "I fight because America's ideals are bigger than the people who fail to live up to them." Washington carefully placed another bottle on the shelf. "I believe in what America could be, should be, and maybe by serving, I can help change things, even just a little." They worked in silence for a few moments as Emiko absorbed his words. She thought about her own country, about the beliefs she'd been raised with, about the absolute certainty she'd once felt in Japan's superiority. "Sometimes," Washington continued, his voice thoughtful, "the hardest battles aren't fought with guns, they're fought in here." He tapped his chest. Fighting hatred, fighting fear, fighting the easy path of seeing others as less than human. Emiko remembered the propaganda posters, the speeches, the ways she'd been taught to see Americans, especially Black Americans, as brutal savages. Yet here was this man, who had every reason to be bitter, showing kindness to his captured enemies. When I was young, she shared, her voice barely above a whisper, my father told me Americans were demons, that you would torture us if we were captured. She met Washington's eyes. But you have shown me nothing but kindness. Hate is taught, Washington replied, moving to sort through a box of supplies. But so is love, so is understanding. He paused, considering his next words. My mama used to say that the real measure of a person isn't how they treat their friends, but how they treat those who are supposed to be their enemies. As they continued their work, Emiko felt something shift inside her. The man beside her was no longer just an American soldier, no longer the enemy she'd been trained to fear and hate. He was a human being who had faced his own struggles, who had chosen compassion over bitterness, understanding over hatred. She watched as he carefully labeled medicine bottles, his movements precise and purposeful. In that moment, she saw beyond his uniform, beyond his role as her captor. She saw someone who, despite facing injustice in his own country, still believed in the possibility of change. Someone who chose to treat others with dignity, even when he had been denied that same respect. The cultural wall, that had seemed so impenetrable, began to crumble, brick by brick, with each shared moment of understanding. As they worked together in the quiet of the medical tent, Emiko felt the weight of her preconceptions lifting, replaced by something new and unexpected: empathy. The morning sun cast long shadows across Angel Island as Emiko made her way to the medical tent, her steps heavy with the news that had arrived overnight. The war was ending. Japan was losing, and soon she would have to return home. She paused outside the tent, watching other prisoners huddle in small groups, their whispers carrying on the cool morning breeze. Some dabbed at tears with their sleeves, while others stood stone-faced, their expressions masking the turmoil within. Did you hear? Yuki, one of the younger nurses, grabbed Emiko's arm. They say we'll be sent back within weeks. Emiko nodded slowly, her throat tight. I heard. What will happen to us? Yuki's voice cracked. They'll say we betrayed our country by surrendering. Will be. She couldn't finish the sentence. Inside the medical tent, Emiko tried to focus on organizing supplies, but her hands trembled as she sorted through bandages. The familiar scent of antiseptic that usually calmed her now made her stomach churn. Corporal Washington entered, carrying a box of new medical supplies. His usual warm smile faded when he saw her face. Everything all right, Miss Takahashi? She couldn't meet his eyes. The war. It's ending. Yes, ma'am. He set down the box carefully. I suppose you'll be heading home soon. The word home hit her like a physical blow. What would home even look like now? The Japan she'd left was proud, undefeated. The Japan she'd returned to would be broken, occupied. Throughout the day, Emiko watched more women break down in tears. Some spoke of families who might reject them for surviving capture. Others worried about finding their homes destroyed, their relatives dead. A few even wondered if death might have been better than the shame of defeat. During lunch, she overheard two women discussing escape plans. Better to die trying than face the disgrace, one whispered. Emiko's chest tightened at their words. The black soldiers maintained their routines, still offering kind words and gentle smiles. Private Harris even brought extra portions to the evening meal, as if good food could ease their fears. Corporal Washington continued their work in the medical tent as always, but Emiko noticed his concerned glances when he thought she wasn't looking. At sunset, Emiko sat on her bunk, watching dust motes dance in the golden light streaming through the window. The barracks buzzed with nervous energy as women packed and repacked their few belongings, as if staying busy could keep their fears at bay. They treated us too well here, Keiko, her bunkmate, whispered. How can we go back to hating them now? How can we face our families when we know the enemy showed us more kindness than our own? And officers ever did? Emiko had no answer. She thought of Corporal Washington's patient explanations as he taught her American medical techniques. Private Harris's shy smile when he brought treats for the sick. The way the black soldiers seemed to understand their fear and uncertainty without judgment. These men, whom she'd been taught to despise, had shown her a different way of being. They'd treated her with dignity when they had every reason not to. And soon, she would leave this strange sanctuary, where enemies had become friends, where her whole understanding of the world had shifted. The setting sun painted the walls orange, then red, then purple. As darkness fell, Emiko listened to the muffled sobs of women around her, each facing their own demons about returning home. She pulled her thin blanket tighter, wondering if the kindness she'd experienced here was just a brief respite in a cruel world, or if it meant something more. Either way, she knew she would never forget it. Emiko sat on her thin mattress, folding her blanket with careful precision. The morning sun streamed through the barrack windows, but the usual quiet was broken by raised voices from the far corner. She looked up to see Yuki and Sachiko, 2 nurses from her old unit, huddled together and speaking in hushed but intense tones. "They're just keeping us calm until they ship us back," Yuki whispered, her voice trembling. "All this kindness, it's just to keep us from causing trouble." Sachiko nodded vigorously. "My cousin wrote me about the American camps for Japanese civilians. They're not all like this one. We've been fooled into thinking these soldiers care about us." Emiko's hands stilled on her blanket. The words hit her like a physical blow, making her stomach twist. She thought of Corporal Washington's gentle smile when he showed her how to organize the medical supplies, the way he always asked about her well-being during their shifts together. More women gathered around Yuki and Sachiko, their worried whispers filling the barracks like rustling leaves. "What will happen to us when we return?" someone asked. "They'll say we betrayed our country by surrendering. The Americans are playing games with us," another voice added. "These black soldiers especially, they must have orders to act this way." Emiko's chest tightened. She wanted to speak up, to defend Corporal Washington and the other soldiers who had shown them nothing but respect. But doubt crept in like a shadow. Had she been naive? Had her loneliness and fear made her see kindness where there was only strategy? The tension in the camp grew throughout the day. At lunch, usually a peaceful time, clusters of women sat with their heads together, speaking in urgent tones. The food remained untouched on many plates, despite being the same generous portions they'd grown accustomed to. By evening, the anxiety had reached a breaking point. A group of 20 women, led by Yuki, gathered outside the commandant's office. Their voices rose in a cacophony of Japanese and broken English. "We demand to know the truth. When are you sending us back? What will happen to us?" Emiko stood at the edge of the crowd, her heart racing. She watched as Captain Stevens emerged from his office, Corporal Washington at his side. The sight of Washington's familiar face made her throat tight with emotion. She remembered their conversation about his struggles back home, the quiet dignity in his voice as he described fighting for a country that didn't always fight for him. As the women's demands echoed across the yard, Emiko found herself studying Washington's expression. There was no hint of deception there, no masked contempt, only the same steady compassion she'd come to know. He caught her eye for a moment, and in that brief connection, she felt her doubts begin to fade. The other women might question everything, but Emiko knew what she had experienced. The warmth in Washington's smile when he taught her. American medical terms, the respect in his voice when he spoke to every prisoner, the genuine interest he showed in their well-being. These things couldn't be faked. They were as real as the ground beneath her feet. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as Captain Stevens stood before the assembled prisoners. His face was stern, his posture rigid. Emiko felt her heart pound as he addressed them, his voice carrying across the yard. "Let me be clear," Stevens said, his jaw set tight. "Any acts of insubordination will be met with swift and appropriate disciplinary action. We have treated you fairly under the Geneva Convention, and we expect cooperation in return." Emiko watched her fellow prisoners shift uncomfortably. Some lowered their heads, while others maintained defiant stares. She understood their fear. It mirrored her own. But there was something else now, a new understanding that made everything more complicated. Later that afternoon, in the medical tent, Emiko sorted supplies while Corporal Washington organized medicine bottles. The usual comfortable silence between them felt heavy today. "Miss Takahashi," Washington said quietly, using her formal name as he always did. "I can see you're troubled." Emiko's hands stilled over the gauze bandages. "The other women, they are scared." "About going home." Washington nodded, his gentle eyes showing concern. "I understand their fear. War changes everything. Homes, people, whole countries." He paused, carefully placing another bottle on the shelf. "I worry about what you'll all face when you return." "You worry? About us?" Emiko looked up, surprised. "Of course I do." Washington's voice was soft but firm. "We've gotten to know you all, treated your injuries, shared meals. You're not just prisoners to us anymore." Tears pricked at Emiko's eyes. She blinked them away, remembering the whispered conversations in the barracks, the accusations that the Americans' kindness was just a facade. "Some think you are only pretending to be kind," she admitted, the words feeling like betrayal on her tongue. Washington was quiet for a moment. "I understand that too. When you've been taught to hate someone, it's hard to believe they could be anything else." He smiled sadly. "I know something about that, growing up where I did." Emiko felt the familiar ache of confusion in her chest. Everything she'd been taught about Americans, about Black Americans especially, had been wrong. Yet her fellow prisoners clung to those beliefs like a lifeline. That evening, as Emiko lay in her bunk, she could hear the whispers around her. Some women spoke of resistance, of staying true to their training. Others worried about being branded traitors for accepting American kindness. "They're trying to trick us," one woman hissed. "Make us soft before they show their true nature." "But they've been nothing but kind," another countered softly, "even when they didn't have to be." Emiko pulled her thin blanket tighter, feeling the weight of both worlds pressing in on her. In one world, there was the fierce loyalty she'd been raised with, the certainty that Americans were the enemy. In the other was the reality she'd discovered. Corporal Washington's gentle hands treating wounds, the guards' respectful nods, the extra portions of food freely given. She felt adrift between these worlds, understanding both but belonging to neither. Her fellow prisoners viewed her growing trust of the Americans with suspicion, while she could no longer share their unshakable hatred. The kindness she'd witnessed wasn't an act. She knew that in her heart. But how could she make others see what she'd seen? How could she bridge this divide when she herself felt so lost? Emiko's heart pounded as she walked toward the camp's main building. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty yard, and she could feel the eyes of her fellow prisoners watching her from the barracks windows. Private Harris, one of the guards, held the door open for her with a gentle nod. Inside, the air felt thick with tension. Captain Stevens stood behind his desk, his face stern and unreadable. Several other officers lined the walls, including Corporal Washington, who stood quietly in the corner, his medical bag at his feet. "Miss Takahashi," Captain Stevens began, his voice formal. "We've received orders regarding the relocation of all prisoners from Angel Island." He paused, shuffling through some papers on his desk. "The war's end is approaching, and preparations must be made for your eventual return to Japan." Emiko's stomach tightened. She had heard whispers about relocations, about other camps where conditions weren't as humane as they were here. Her fingers twisted together as she listened. "The new facility is further inland," Stevens continued. "The transfer will begin next week. We expect full cooperation from all prisoners." A murmur of concern rippled through the officers present. Emiko noticed Washington shift his weight, his usually calm face showing signs of distress. "Sir," Washington suddenly spoke up, taking a step forward. "If I may speak freely?" Stevens raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Go ahead, Corporal." "These women have been model prisoners," Washington said, his voice steady but urgent. "They've followed every rule, caused no trouble. The medical facilities here are established, and we've developed protocols that work. Moving them now, especially with limited resources at the new location." He paused, gathering his courage. "Sir, it would be a mistake." The room fell silent. Emiko watched as other officers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Speaking against orders wasn't something soldiers did, especially not Black soldiers in 1945. "Are you questioning direct orders, Corporal?" Stevens asked, his voice sharp. "No, sir. I'm advocating for the dignified treatment of prisoners under our care, as per the Geneva Convention." Washington stood straighter, though Emiko could see the tension in his shoulders. "The new facility isn't properly equipped for female prisoners. They'll be mixed in with male prison of wars, with inadequate medical supervision." Several white officers shifted uncomfortably. One made a dismissive sound, but Washington continued. "These women deserve better than being shipped off like cargo. They've shown us respect. We owe them the same in return." Emiko felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. In all her time in Japan, she had never seen someone stand up to authority like this, especially not for the sake of the enemy. "You're out of line, Washington," one of the other officers snapped. "These are orders from above." "Then I respectfully request that we appeal those orders," Washington replied, his voice never wavering. "Sir," he turned back to Stevens, "you've seen how we've operated here, the trust we've built. Moving them now would destroy all that progress." Captain Stevens leaned back in his chair, studying Washington carefully. Emiko held her breath, struck by the courage it must have taken for Washington to speak up, knowing the consequences he might face. The silence stretched out, heavy with possibility and fear. In that moment, Emiko saw Washington not just as a kind man, but as someone willing to risk everything for what he believed was right. The propaganda she'd been raised with seemed like a distant memory now, shattered by this simple act of moral courage. The news came on a hot August morning. Emiko was helping sort medical supplies when she heard the commotion outside. Soldiers were gathering around a radio, their faces a mixture of joy and disbelief. Japan had surrendered. Her hands trembled as she set down the bandages she'd been counting. The war was over. After 2 years in the camp, the reality she'd been dreading had finally arrived. She would have to go home. "Miss Takahashi?" Corporal Washington's gentle voice broke through her thoughts. He stood in the doorway of the medical supply room, his expression soft with concern. "I thought you should hear it from me first. They're making arrangements for repatriation." Emiko nodded, unable to speak. The kindness in his eyes made her throat tight with emotion. This man, whom she'd once been taught to fear and hate, had become a symbol of everything she'd learned about humanity during her time here. Later that day, Captain Stevens called all the women to gather in the mess hall. The room buzzed with nervous whispers as he explained the process. "You'll be transported by ship back to Japan," he said. "We've made arrangements to ensure your safety and comfort during the journey." Emiko watched the Black American soldiers stationed around the room. They stood tall and dignified, their faces showing the same respect they'd demonstrated since day one. Private Harris, who had once given her a flower, gave her a small nod. Sergeant Thompson, who always snuck extra portions to the older women, stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking proud and somewhat sad. That evening, as Emiko packed her few belongings, she overheard some of the women talking. "They protected us," one whispered. "Who would have thought the Americans, especially the black soldiers, would be so kind?" Another woman wiped tears from her eyes. "I was so scared when we first arrived, but they treated us like human beings, not enemies." Emiko's hands paused over her small bundle of possessions. She thought about how different reality had turned out to be from everything she'd been taught. The propaganda, the hatred, the fear, it had all melted away in the face of simple human kindness. The next morning, as the women prepared to board the trucks that would take them to the port, Corporal Washington supervised the loading of medical supplies for their journey. Emiko watched him work, remembering all the moments they'd shared in the medical tent, the quiet conversations, the gentle lessons in humanity, the gradual breaking down of walls built by war and prejudice. He caught her eye as she waited in line with her fellow prisoners. For a moment, they just looked at each other, worlds of unspoken understanding passing between them. Here was a man who had faced discrimination in his own country, yet chose to treat his supposed enemies with dignity and respect. He had shown her that goodness could exist even in the darkest times, that humanity could bridge the deepest divides. Emiko felt tears welling in her eyes, but she held them back. Around her, other women were saying quiet goodbyes to the soldiers who had guarded them with such unexpected grace. Some of the women bowed deeply, a gesture of respect none of them could have imagined offering 2 years ago. As Emiko stepped toward the waiting truck, she took one last look at Corporal Washington. He stood straight and tall in his uniform, a gentle smile on his face, embodying everything she had learned about true strength and dignity during her time as a prisoner of war. Emiko sat on the deck of the transport ship, watching the vast Pacific waters stretch endlessly before her. The gentle rocking of the vessel matched the rhythm of her thoughts as she held a wrinkled piece of paper in her hands. She had been working on this letter to Corporal Washington for days, crossing out words and starting over multiple times. The salty breeze tousled her hair as she pressed her pencil to the paper once more. "Dear Corporal Washington," she wrote, her English careful and deliberate. "I hope this letter finds you well." She paused, considering her words carefully. How could she possibly express everything she wanted to say? Other women from the camp sat nearby, some talking quietly among themselves, others lost in their own thoughts. Many of them had changed during their time at Angel Island, just as she had. Emiko noticed how they no longer spoke of the Americans with hatred or fear. She returned to her letter. "I want to thank you for showing me kindness when I expected cruelty. You helped me see that people are more than the labels we give them." Her hand trembled slightly as she wrote, "I will never forget how you treated us with dignity, even when others questioned your choices." The ship's horn sounded, startling her. A flock of seabirds scattered into the air, their wings catching the golden light of sunset. Emiko watched them disappear into the horizon, thinking about how free they seemed, unbound by the divisions humans created. Sometimes, she continued writing, I think about our conversations in the medical tent. You taught me that courage isn't just about fighting battles. It's about standing up for what's right, even when it's difficult. Your stories about life in America opened my eyes to struggles I never knew existed. A few teardrops fell onto the paper, smudging some of the words. Emiko wiped her eyes with her sleeve and kept writing. I don't know if this letter will reach you, or if you'll be allowed to write back, but I want you to know that you changed something in me. The hatred I was taught to feel has been replaced by understanding. She looked up at the sky, now painted in shades of orange and purple. Japan was still days away, but already she felt the weight of returning home. What would she find there? How would she explain to her family that her enemies had become her teachers? The other women still whisper about how different you American soldiers were from what we expected, she wrote. Especially you and the other black soldiers. Your kindness broke through walls we thought were unbreakable. Emiko paused, watching the waves crash against the ship's hull. The ocean seemed smaller now, less like a barrier between enemies and more like a connection between people who had learned to see each other's humanity. At the bottom of the letter, she carefully wrote her family's address in Kyoto, hoping it would still be there when she returned. If you can write back, I would be honored to hear from you. Even if you cannot, please know that you have taught me lessons I will carry forever. She signed her name, folding the paper carefully and slipping it into an envelope she had saved. Tomorrow, she would give it to one of the American officers who had promised to deliver mail once they reached port. Whether it would reach Corporal Washington remained uncertain, but writing it had helped her understand her own transformation. As darkness fell over the Pacific, Emiko held the letter close to her chest. Each mile closer to Japan filled her with a mixture of anticipation and loss. She was returning home a different person, someone who had learned that humanity could flourish even in the harshest conditions, and that kindness could bridge the deepest divides. Emiko sat at her worn wooden desk, her fountain pen hovering over the fresh page of her manuscript. Sunlight streamed through her study window, casting a warm glow on the stacks of papers that documented her wartime memories. At 65, her hands weren't as steady as they once were, but her mind remained sharp, especially when it came to those transformative days at Angel Island. The kindness of those men, she wrote, her neat characters flowing across the page, changed everything I thought I knew about humanity. They were supposed to be our enemies, yet they showed us more compassion than we had ever expected. She paused, touching the small, dried flower pressed between the pages of her diary, the same one Private Harris had given her all those years ago. The petals had faded, but the memory remained vibrant. She carefully transferred this story to her manuscript, describing how such a simple gesture had cracked the foundation of her wartime prejudices. Her memoir took shape over months of careful writing. Each chapter revealed another layer of her transformation, from the fear and hatred she'd been taught to the profound understanding she'd gained through her interactions with the Black American soldiers. She wrote extensively about Corporal Washington, describing his gentle manner in the medical tent and his courage in standing up for the prison of wars. They called them movie stars. She wrote, but it wasn't just their appearance that captivated us. It was their dignity, their humanity, in the face of their own struggles with discrimination. They showed us what it meant to rise above hatred. Publishers initially hesitated to take on such a controversial topic. Japan was still reconciling with its wartime past, and many preferred to let sleeping dogs lie. But Emiko persisted, knowing the importance of sharing these stories of unexpected kindness during humanity's darkest hours. When the memoir finally found a publisher, it resonated deeply with readers. Letters poured in from around the world, from veterans, from children of war, from people who had never known conflict, but were moved by her story of transformation. Many wrote about how her experiences helped them confront their own prejudices. At her first speaking engagement, Emiko stood before a crowded auditorium in Tokyo. Her voice trembled slightly as she began, but grew stronger as she shared her story. We were taught to see them as monsters, she told the audience. Instead, they taught us about dignity, about treating others with respect, even when your own country denies you the same. She spoke of the whispers that had spread through the camp, how the women's perception of their captors had slowly shifted from fear to admiration. She described the daily interactions that had broken down walls of prejudice, built by years of propaganda and war. The lesson I learned, she said, her voice clear and steady, was that humanity exists even in the midst of war. Those soldiers could have treated us with the same hatred they faced at home. Instead, they chose to show us kindness. They chose to be better than what the world expected of them. International peace. Organizations began inviting her to share her story. In conference halls from Geneva to San Francisco, Emiko spoke about reconciliation and the prison of wearer of unexpected kindness. Her message was simple but profound. Peace begins with seeing the humanity in those we're taught to hate. Every time I speak about my experiences, she wrote in her journal after one such conference, I remember Corporal Washington's smile, Private Harris's flower, and all those small acts of kindness that showed us a different way. They did more than just care for us as prisoners. They taught us how to be human again. Tokyo, 1965. The autumn breeze carried cherry blossom petals across the courtyard of the International Peace Center. Emiko Takahashi smoothed her navy blue dress, her silver-streaked hair neatly pinned back. At 65, she still carried herself with the same quiet dignity she had learned as a young nurse. Her heart quickened as she spotted him among the crowd. Corporal James Washington, now with gray at his temples but still standing tall and proud. He wore a well-pressed suit, and his warm brown eyes hadn't changed a bit. For a moment, she was transported back to that prison of war camp on Angel Island, where a young Black American soldier had shown her what true humanity looked like. Mrs. Takahashi, he said, his voice gentle and familiar as he approached. It's been too long. Emiko bowed deeply, then extended her hand in the Western style. Corporal Washington, I never thought I would see you again. He chuckled softly. Just James now. I left the army long ago. They found a quiet corner of the garden, away from the bustle of the peace ceremony. Cherry blossoms drifted around them as they sat on a wooden bench, the same kind of peaceful silence between them that they had shared in the medical tent all those years ago. I read your memoir, Washington said, pulling a worn copy from his briefcase. The book's cover showed a black and white photograph of Angel Island. You captured it all so well, the fear, the confusion, and then the unexpected kindness. Emiko finished, touching the book's spine gently. Your kindness, Washington shook his head modestly. We were all just trying to do what was right. But you did more than that, Emiko said, her voice thick with emotion. You showed me, that everything we had been taught about Americans, about Black Americans especially, was wrong. You helped me see past the hatred I had been raised with. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the cherry blossoms dance in the breeze. Emiko remembered the first time she had seen him in the camp, how terrified she had been, and how that fear had slowly transformed into respect, then understanding, and finally friendship. Do you remember, she said softly, that first day in the medical tent, when you bandaged my hand? Washington nodded, a gentle smile crossing his face. You were shaking like a leaf, but you still managed to thank me in perfect English. I was so confused, Emiko admitted. You were supposed to be my enemy, but you treated my wound with such care. It was the beginning of everything changing for me. The sounds of the peace ceremony drifted toward them. Speeches about reconciliation, about building bridges between nations. But here, in this quiet corner of the garden, Emiko and Washington had their own moment of reconciliation. Two people who had found humanity in the midst of war. Looking at him now, Emiko saw not just the man before her, but also the young soldier who had shown such compassion to a frightened Japanese nurse. His face was lined with age, but his eyes still held that same kindness that had changed her life. She leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. You look like a movie star, she said, smiling at the memory of those whispered conversations in the camp. And I was wrong about everything. I hope you like this story. Please share what signs, your favorite part of the story, and where in the world you are watching from. Have a wonderful day.